just the community. So within that, obviously, as recognised in the report I just held up, and many other people's pieces of work, we know that LGBT plus individuals who are experiencing domestic abuse can have extremely severe and protracted experiences. They can be quite different from people who aren't identifying that way, in terms of early experiences that they might have if there's a rupture in the family, which then leads on to subsequent exploitative and abusive situations that can be kind of doubling people's experience and feel like a very kind of hostile environment in multiple different directions. And then again, if you kind of add into that, that somebody might also be facing additional barriers and challenges because of their religion or ethnicity or race, or disability, then we are kind of piling up different ways in which people are going to be struggling and really having to kind of fight through so many barriers to get what they need and to get the suitable thing that they need. And COVID, we know, has exacerbated a lot of people's experiences. I think it's fair to say we shouldn't pretend at the moment that we know exactly what's been going on for people. But certainly I know from talking to Nick and team at the Galop helpline, they've had some very complex calls. They've had people staying on calls for a lot longer because of what's going on for them, the severity, the complexity, the emotional damage that's going on. So loads for us to talk about this afternoon. So proud of some of the things that SafeLives has been able to do with colleagues so far. But as I hope I've kept reiterating, there is so much amazing work going on out there. Some brilliant contributors this afternoon. I am so excited to hear this afternoon's conversation. It sits within a context within society where there is still so much for us to do. And, I need to tell people on this call that at some times we're going backwards as well as trying to go forwards. So it's a kind of reverse and progress mechanism the whole time. And, LGBT plus rights are under attack in many countries where they should have been making the most progress. And in some countries haven't made as much progress to start with. So plenty of work for us to do, but some incredible people doing that work and engaged in that work. I hope it's going to be a really fantastic set of conversations this afternoon. And I'm really delighted to hand over, first of all, to the first Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, Nicole Jacobs.
Great, thank you. I don't have props. I wish I had thought of that. Darn it, next time. And it's great to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be asked. So thank you to Suzanne and to Michelle for organizing. And I feel the same about this afternoon. I really look forward to just saying a few words to you by way of introduction and a bit of my ambition in the role, but also to then sit back and listen to the speakers today. I'm so excited about this session in particular. It's a great way to not necessarily end the day, because I'm sure it won't actually be the end of the day quite yet, but getting close to it. So for those of you who've never met me before, who don't know me, my name is Nicole Jacobs. I'm the Designate Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, and appointed in late September. So designate because some of the powers of my office are in the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is now making its way through the parliamentary process. And hopefully at some stage in the year, I'll drop that term designate and just use Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And some of what I'd like to talk to you about is kind of my role, some of the nuts and bolts of what I've been asked to do, because I think it's highly relevant to our discussion today. Some of my thinking in terms of why I would have ever even applied or wanted to be the Domestic Abuse Commissioner is that I've worked for many years in the sector for some of the organizations here today, and certainly alongside many of the organizations. So I've worked most recently in West London at Standing Together, and Galop is one of our key partners, and has been for some years. And so I really bring my thoughts of my thinking about the role is very much rooted in the coordinated community response to domestic abuse, we sometimes use different terms for that, but essentially what that means to me is that our specialist services and the voice of the survivor have to sit in the center of what we do, and not necessarily, in every way consulted, integrated, co-created in what we want to see as our frontline services, and our community-based and statutory services sitting alongside, working in partnership to achieve much earlier intervention, prevention, and really getting it right, more likely for the first time. And there's some great practice around the country, but we don't have anywhere near what we need to have in terms of service provision at the local level, which was part of the reason why the Domestic Abuse Commissioner office or post was created. And it's certainly what I'm set out to do. But I suppose I just want you to know that I bring with me to the role the thoughts of not just mapping specialist services, but the whole of provision of services. And that very much in my mind includes where we have patchy service provision. And certainly if there's ever an example of that, it would be in this area for LGBT plus survivors of domestic abuse. And I would like to really think of working with people who are on this call very much in partnership about having to address that in the mapping that my office will be doing, and the kind of advocacy to government, but local and nationally, and funders elsewhere about how we can address that postcode lottery in all respects. And I think that there's a lot that our statutory services can do and improve in thinking about intersectional issues, as Suzanne said, but also just very good basic practice in relation to domestic abuse. So those are the kinds of things that my office will be doing. So we're piloting some of that mapping in 4 areas right now, in really learning as an office, which is a brand new office, newly hired, and not even fully staffed yet, but really thinking, how can we do this efficiently in a way that will influence government on all levels the most. And so we are getting underway, but obviously the last few weeks during COVID has diverted our attention because there's just been so much to do. And Peter will know this, and Nick, who's recently left Galop, will know that every Monday I host a call, and Galop sits on that call along with other national services to help us identify very early in the week what are the changes or kind of demands of our key services, including our national policing picture, and also, what are our officials and government departments doing or not doing, and how can we accelerate that as quickly as possible, any of those issues. So I think Suzanne's exactly right, and I probably won't speak for Peter, but it's certainly come through loud and clear that the complexity that is coming through on the national helplines, in particular, Galop service, is really notable, and the added pressures of people maybe moving home, younger people who are moving back into the family home, and issues related to homophobia, and lack of feeling of acceptance and additional abuses that happen in regard to that. And so I would hope that that's coming through in some of the support for the sector, but obviously we are nowhere near where we need to be. So I just wanted to give you a little sense of what my office is setting out to do, and a total open invitation for you to be in touch with me directly and my office directly, because I really do see it as my job to be as much as I can in my office, or anyone working in my office, representing the interests and the voice, and amplifying the voice of survivors as much as I possibly can. And that is, I can only do that in partnership with you. And so I will be sitting and listening to what you have to say today, and hopefully hearing and learning some things that I very likely haven't thought about or considered as much as I should have. And I think we all have to have a degree of humility in any of these conversations to know that we have a long way to go. We're not nearly there. And I just hope that my office can play some role in getting us where we need to be in partnership with you. So thank you for having me. And I will stay till the very end and be really happy to field any questions and also any suggestions from you in terms of next steps, medium term, long-term steps. And I hope that when we come back, say in a year's time, when we've built back better, as everyone keeps saying, that we'll have made some real strides in terms of ending some of the postcode lottery, and in particular for LGBT victims of domestic abuse. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you, Nicole. That was really, really interesting to hear, and just such a generous offer from you as well, which I think is, you know, something I and us as an organisation have been aware of since you came into post, just the kind of continually asking, you know, tell me I'm listening, and so to have that sort of reinforced now is great. So thank you for that. I hadn't got a question and answer session scheduled, but I do think it might be quite a nice opportunity, and no pressure panel, should any of the panel members have a question that they might like to ask Nicole while we've got this opportunity, then please feel free to do so.
Not even a question. If you just want to give me some ideas or tell me what you think I should be doing, I'm very happy. Or just to leave it as an open invitation to always be in touch directly, that I would really want to be hearing from you.
I have a question, as is so often the way. Hi, so to people who don't know me, my name's James Rowland. So I'm on the panel, and I've worked in the domestic violence sector, and I'm currently a DHR chair. And but I was previously a commissioner. And Nicole, I guess my question was about how you really encourage commissioners and partnerships to foreground work with different communities, in this case LGBT communities. And I suppose I'm conscious of the national statement of expectations, which was heralded as a great start, and was actually a bit of a damp squid, and talked about LGBT victims, of course, but doesn't necessarily seem to have prompted much change or given traction to those needs of those different communities. And I know you're right at the start of your own work and mapping, but I just wondered how you were thinking about how you get traction to really embed work within commissioning, within partnerships, and across government agencies around these kind of issues, which can very quickly drop off the agenda.
I guess my initial thoughts about that are that I think it's very likely that the powers in the office of the commissioner will end up pretty similar to what they are now. In other words, you know, the reality of this bill process is that the government has a very strong majority, and they've decided quite a bit in terms of the remit of my role. That doesn't mean I don't hold out hope for other changes to the bill or maybe an expansion of my role, but certainly as it sets out now, there will be an expectation that I will, or that my office will kind of monitor local provision. And I did an event the other day with the LGA, the Local Government Association, and one of the things I went to great pains to say to them is, you know, what I worry about as the commissioner is that the government will have kind of set me up as a bit of, a monitoring device or a bit of a stick to kind of go to local areas and say, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, despite the fact that they haven't been given proper resource, or in my view, there should be a statutory duty that is funded to really broaden what local authorities could do. And so it is going to be about working in partnership, I think, and making sure that I use my powers in such a way, or the office, not my personal power, but the office uses its power in such a way that it really influences local government, but there will no doubt be some benchmarking, you know, and I do think, you know, having some analysis of where services are funded, where they're patchy, why, you know, how in an issue like this, you know, there's a greater need for regional, kind of a regional approach or cross-boundary approach. And I think that, you know, I can see, and just in the few months I've been appointed, that my role can make those conversations more likely to happen. I think the powers in the bill certainly will create an ability to do kind of thematic review or spotlight that makes it much clearer and really drive at that change. If there's anything I've learned during COVID, is it's been a bit of a accelerated course in how government works for me, you know, having been from the sector. Suzanne, you know, is very well versed in this with her background, and sometimes we talk about that. But what I've realized with government is, you know, they're very focused on what the minister would want them to do in the short term, in that day or week. And despite having kind of, you know, aims and objectives, sometimes holding government account is, I've realized how my role in doing that can be quite effective, because I have nothing to do but try to drive that change. That's my whole role in life. And so will be my team. And I have great partners like people on this call to be able to do that with. But I think government gets quite easily distracted and easily moved to, you know, swayed in one direction or another. And my job is to help them bring back to, you know, the priorities they've set for themselves and hold them to account. So I can see many ways of doing it, but what I don't want to do is do it in such a way that local government perceives some of the powers that my office has been given as kind of the bad, you know, the bad guy in this, and that I want local government to feel empowered to really have those, to really meet our expectations of them. And that's by working in partnership with PCCs, CCGs, you know, there's joined up commissioning that needs to happen. But also national government needs to help support ambitions. It can't be a national statement of expectation that kind of never quite gets implemented. So I hope that helps. I will try my very best. And I think, you know, some of the work that you're doing, James, and others will really help, you know, and making sure that we have these conversations and that it's really clear where we do and do not have adequate provision, and reminding government of all levels of that until we get it.
Can I come in, Michelle? Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine, of course. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, I'm
Thanks,
Catherine. Donovan. I'm on the panel. Nice to meet you, Nicole. It's kind of a bit leading on from that question, which is specifically about funding sources for the LGBT domestic abuse sector, because it seems to me, I mean, I've just been working with the sector and just a very small snapshot study just before the lockdown to kind of capture some of their experiences of how much they work beyond their remit and how much they work extra hours to do their work. And what comes across really clearly is not being able to get core funding. And we know that in general terms, the LGBT sector, not specific to domestic violence, but the LGBT sector gets disproportionately less statutory funding than other sectors. So we can assume that the same thing is happening there. So I suppose it's about whether there's an opportunity for your office to kind of really map that and the impacts of it on what can feel like, when you're working in it, a very precarious sector that isn't able to forward plan very much, which hasn't got that kind of back office administrative infrastructure, fundraising roles in the organisations. Many of them are too small to have those kinds of roles, and then often, because funding is precarious, what you're often also then doing is doing a lot of credibility work that again you're not paid to do, but is absolutely part of building the case. You're constantly building the case to justify your existence to funders who are interested in innovative projects but are less interested in core funding. So I just wonder if there's a role there for you to be able to kind of map that. And obviously austerity has made that much worse, but you know, you could track that and see what the cumulative impact of that is on relatively small organisations.
Yeah, I think there's some real parallels to you know, disability organizations and other smaller charities where you would most definitely make that argument. I couldn't agree with you more. And I suppose I'm aware that there has been some great work done and research. There's been great commissioning guidance in this area, for example. So I'm really mindful to not try to recreate any of that really good work that's already out there, but to really try to amplify what we have and also fill any gaps. You're exactly right in terms of what would it take to make that argument more clearly. Quite happily, you know, using resource in the office to try to do that, and then make that case as strongly as possible, and then carry on with the advocacy until we get it done. I do think, you know, government can have a short attention span despite having great objectives, and I really do feel that the advantage of having a commissioner, I'm learning, is that our collective attention span is much longer, and if we work together and bring together the best of our information, then I think the case is so clear. It's just so blatantly obvious, and so I'd really like to help do that as much as I possibly can. But I would be frankly quite reliant on expertise of people like you and people on this call to help gauge, you know, what would good look like, what do we really need, what do we actually have right now, and what do we really need, and what would it take to get there. So a regional approach or kind of across, you know, and maybe it's a national plan, in terms of, instead of leaving these to localized decisions, maybe there's a case to be made, obviously, for a much more national kind of planning and implementation for core funding. I totally agree with you.
Thanks, everybody. That was really interesting to hear. And in your introduction, Nicole, when you talked about great partnership working and great practice, it just really made me think about us as an organisation and what we, you know, kind of inherently do, and is, you know, a key reason why we're all on this call today, and particularly thinking about the whole family multi-agency response. That is obviously something that is incredibly dear to our hearts, and I'm going to just quickly ask the remaining panel members to introduce themselves in a moment, but we've got one panel member missing today. She's going to join us at 3 o'clock, so we had to sort of do a bit of a last minute shift around of the running order, but it's because she's at Marac, and she said, you know, everybody in the organisation, they were so committed to being here, but also wanting to go to the Marac meeting. So Maddi is representing RISE at the local Marac meeting this afternoon, which I think just shows so many positives in so many ways, not least that RISE exists as an organisation and that they're part of the Marac process, so that they're invited and they're participants in that. So yeah, I just thought it's a really good thing to kind of consider, along with some of the things that you've all just kind of talked about then, with what can we do going forward from today, because I don't think today will be the end at all. We've certainly got some resources from some of the panel members to share, and I'm just so grateful to them all, because they all have a day job, and as we've all realised with each other over the last week or so, you are incredibly busy panel members, as is everybody on the call, so we are so grateful. And of course it's gorgeous weather outside, and not sure if anybody is listening to this in the garden with a gin. You know, if you can be, then please go and do that. But we are so grateful, and the panel are here today to share their individual, their kind of joining up their experience is something that we felt was a really great opportunity. So we've tried to construct the day that you're not just kind of listening to a sort of show and tell presentation, but like we've just done with Nicole as well, that there's opportunities for the panel to have a conversation with each other, where that feels right to have. And obviously, as you will know from the invitation, what's really important and relevant about having this get together in this month is it's June, it's Pride Month. And certainly as somebody who lives close to Manchester, it's a massive, wonderful celebration. So it's not quite Pride, unless any of the attendees have got any ideas of what we might do this afternoon to give a little bit of Pride spirit to it. I'm not sure. But we were really, really grateful that we could at least acknowledge the huge importance that all of you as LGBT specialist organisations bring to this, but everybody on the call as well is here because they want to hear from the panel your understanding and experience. And I know I'm not allowed to say expertise, but certainly, you know, it really does feel we've got so many experts on the call today. Just as a reminder, we are recording the call, so if you don't want to be heard, then please bear that in mind. Also, as is going to be a new language, as Catherine and I were just talking about a few minutes ago, please mute yourselves unless you're actually invited to speak. What we're going to do is have the panel members are going to present, and then we're going to have a short conversation if they want to ask questions of each other. And then I'm going to come to the audience, but to try and manage it, because obviously I think there's about 50, 60 people on the call today, is if you would put there's 63 people on the call today, if you would put your questions into the chat box, my colleagues are going to try and sort of pull out the questions that they think will be the questions that are most suitable for all of us here today. We'll try and answer things separately if we don't get round to them this afternoon. But we've also got a great new thing that is new to us that we want to do with you called Mentimeter. And if you haven't seen it before, then I think prepared to be amazed with how we can really capture what you're thinking live, we hope. All keep our fingers crossed for the technology. So we're going to work with that throughout the presentations. And Ella, do you think it's the best thing that we ask everybody to go onto it now, or shall we wait till we actually...
we can do, if that's easier, if you'd like not want to disrupt the flow of presentations.
Let's do that and get that out of the way, because I intended doing all this right at the very beginning, actually, and here we are. So, Ella, do you want to talk people through actually getting onto Menti? I think you're probably better than I am to do that.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just going to share my screen because that'll probably just be easier for now, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. So, as Michelle said, we're going to be using a tool today. Is that okay? Can everyone see that? Can anyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So you'll see here, if I just go to present, you can see at the top it says go to www.menti.com and then use the code when prompted 641708. I'll just give everyone a minute to do that.
And we don't want you to answer the question yet.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
Don't even look at the question.
So I hope everyone's had a chance to go on to that. You will be shown that again. So don't worry if you didn't get a chance or it hasn't worked for the moment. But if you have any questions, put them in the chat and I'll be able to answer them, or one of my colleagues can answer them. But basically what it does is when you're prompted to, if you just keep that browser open on your phone or your laptop or whatever you find easiest, when you're prompted to, you can answer one of those questions, and then you'll see the live results on the screen come up in front of you, which will be really cool, and it will help the presenters and for you to digest the information and to see what everyone else thinks.
Thank you, Ella. And what Ella is going to do throughout this is share her screen when it's relevant for the panel members to go through their presentation. We will ask you when you need to go on to the Mentimeter when the panel who's presenting gets to that point in their presentation. Then you'll come back to the to seeing Ella's screen share, but she'll take that off when it's not needed, so that you can see the panel members' lovely faces. Okay, so we've heard from Catherine and James already. I'm just going to ask Elly and then Saskia, if you would just really quickly just say who you are and what organisation you're representing on the panel today.
So I'm Elly. I'm representing a project called Call It Out, which is based in Say It in Sheffield, which is an LGBT organisation. That's enough for now.
Thanks, Elly. Saskia?
Hi, I'm Saskia. I'm the CEO of a generic domestic abuse organisation. I hate the word generic, so I don't think we are generic. I think we're really great, but we're based in Cheshire and we're not an LGBT specialist.
Yeah, and I have to say, Saskia, I'm not sure there's anything generic about you or the organisation. Thank you very much. Peter, can I ask you to introduce yourself, and then we are going to seamlessly go straight into your presentation. Ella, can you be ready to start screen sharing for Peter's presentation?
Absolutely, no problem.
Thank you. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Can you hear me? So I'm Peter Kelley, and I'm the service lead for Galop, and we are a national LGBT DV, hate crime and sexual violence organisation. We run a national LGBT helpline. So thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. Do you want me to go straight in? Can't hear you. Oh yeah,
Thank you. Please.
This is the point where the internet crashes, isn't it? So I'm gonna basically do. I mean, we've only got 10 minutes, so this is very much going to be an overview of, I think, really what's sort of happening for us as a sort of, we're still relatively small, you know, and I really appreciate, you know, being referenced by Nicole and Suzanne and others of makes us sound like this massive organisation. Actually, we're very small. Relatively, so it's what's going on for us now, and actually just thinking about what possibly, you know, particularly for, you know, there's a few commissioners here and things about thinking about how we might go forward and learn and deliver services, I think, as some of you have raised. Yeah. Okay, so next slide, if that's okay. That's just about us, really. We run the National LGBT DV Helpline. We provide advocacy services, both IDVA and ISVA services, and we do some work around young LGBT people and trans people. And we also do kind of a little bit of kind of strategic policy work and research, actually, because it's interesting. I think that point Catherine and others were alluding to. There's no sort of second tier organisation, you know, for example, with BME organisation, where you have an organisation like IMCAN, for example, who represents BME women, for example, on that strategic level, and there's not really that. And so we've kind of moved in. We're not the only person, but we do a little bit of that. But I'm going to be focusing more on our sort of service delivery on this presentation. So what's the experience of our clients? I mean, I think it's interesting that the National College of Policing sort of says that overall kind of crime has gone down, including domestic abuse a little bit in terms of reports, but most helplines have seen an increase in help seeking, you know, whether they're VORG organisations or LGBT. So for us, we've seen something like a 30 to 50% increase in help seekers. I think the nature of calls have changed during lockdown as well. So you know, there's that phase at the beginning, and then there's going into it as well, sort of, you know, I don't think we're quite out of it, but actually what people are coming to us has sort of changed slightly over the last 3 months. And our advocacy services have seen an increase in help seekers as well. So I think for lots of small services as well, even a relatively small increase can have a big impact on the service. So earlier in lockdown, what we noticed with help seekers is a number of things. So what changed? So one of the things is I think friends and family. We saw an increase there, calling about survivors that were in lockdown with abusive partners. with concerns there, and also concerns about people they knew who were potentially perpetrators as well. So that was a kind of a new development for us, really. Like, rather than survivors coming to us directly, it was friends and family. The other thing was actually there was a lot of kind of discussion around how DV would increase under lockdown, and the opposite of that was for survivors who weren't living with the abusive partner, actually saw that as an opportunity to separate from abusive partnerships. So that was kind of interesting. They were coming to us looking for sort of support and advice about, you know, how to take out an injunction, how to sort of exit that relationship safely where they could. And then I think, as Nicole referenced as well, we had, you know, we saw that we were getting calls for a longer duration, and a lot of that was around kind of emotional support and anxiety, you know, help seeking near the beginning. And there was a change in kind of the way people contacted us as well. So we run a small pilot sort of web chat service in the evening, so we saw that increasing. We saw generally more calls in the evening when we were open, and a lot more website traffic where people were looking for information about domestic abuse. So that was a really big increase in people looking at the kind of those pages on our website there. So that was kind of a few interesting developments, yeah. And then later in lockdown, now I say this, we are doing like a COVID survey actually, and we're going to have probably quite a few hundred respondents, but we haven't got that back yet. So this kind of is very much sort of anecdotal, but I think it also picks up on what Suzanne was saying, you know, the findings of the SafeLives research, and also we've done. So what were these experiences? We've definitely seen a lot more younger LGBT people. So when I say younger, it's often people under 35. So not, you know, but also people in their teens as well. So as well as interpersonal violence, we've seen DV, you know, triggered by responses to sexuality and gender identity, as survivors at home a lot more with family. So there's little bits of things like so-called honor-based violence, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia that have increased during that time as well. So young people feeling really up against it. And of course, those services that they might go to are not there. You know, those kind of, those links have disappeared. And I think as well, the thing Catherine Donovan sometimes talks about, the public story of DV, is that sort of very heteronormative approach. And what we've seen is actually LGBT people in non-traditional households. So an example of that is LGBT people living in with flatmates and things like that are, after a period of time, again, prejudices increase. We've seen different and more complex needs. So again, referenced in SafeLives, you know, more clients using chems. So crystal meth is a very London-based thing, gay and bi men and some trans women. A lot more suicide ideation, people not coping there. And there's higher numbers in our community of those kind of things. And isolation as well, because lots of people are living on their own or just with the abuser, and actually they don't have those social networks they can go to, even those virtual networks. And I think as well, you know, those intersectional things. So the impacts for BAME clients as well around things like policing and being worried about, you know, kind of if they're having to kind of report. We had a client who was worried about being stopped and searched if he was leaving his house to go and report. And we've seen a spike in clients with no recourse to public funds who have very little choices and decision making around exiting abusive relationships. And then as well, so I mentioned at the beginning that emotional support, and we've seen a shift of actually more people, more survivors looking for actually practical help and support. So a big thing on the help was people saying wanting counselling, but actually it's been specific things around housing, economic abuse, and civil injunctions, for example. And the last thing I think as well, the lack of refuge accommodation. This is something we talk about all the time. You know, LGBT people have very few safe spaces they can go to, and that's had an impact as well there. What's the impact for us as an organisation? So our caseworkers in this, I think it's been harder to engage clients in a trauma-informed way, particularly those with multiple needs. it's very difficult to build a rapport with clients, you know, and get a feel for actually where they're standing and what they want. So that's had an impact. And Nicole mentioned, you know, coordinated community response. So that's hard to do that, where, you know, MARACs are still taking place, but there are fewer and more limited opportunities, and a sense for our caseworkers of having to do a lot of holding of survivors there, emotional and practical holding support. And the impacts on staff themselves, I mean, this is true, I'm sure, across the board, just burnout, working in isolation, and as well as COVID, you've got, you know, for some of our staff, some of our BME staff, you've got Black Lives Matter, and the impact on that has been huge, I think, for them as individuals and their feelings of where they sit in an organisation. And also recently the leak around the changes to the Gender Recognition Act, and some of our trans and non-binary staff feeling sort of very attacked by that. Positive engagement, though, I think actually we've seen where we've talked to our colleagues about counselling, for example, actually remote counselling has been a real boon to some survivors. And when we're thinking about provision, that's really helpful. So we've got far fewer do not attends. It's not suitable for everybody, but it means we're able to kind of run a Pan London, or our colleagues at London Friend are able to run a Pan London counselling service. Last thing there, I think, what the opportunities, some positives, I think, around services still being delivered remotely. There's so few of LGBT services anyway. Actually, a lot of the way we deliver our services is kind of through telephone advocacy and support anyway. And as I mentioned with the counselling, it's looking for new ways of working. We were able actually for the first time to secure some temporary funding for an LGBT refuge in London, because that's never existed before. It's just for 6 months, but that's already full. Raising the profile of LGBT DV, for example, Nicole mentioned, you know, the meetings, and we've had a lot of really positive engagement. That's something for commissioners to think about. Actually, it's you know, not juxtaposed LGBT and VOG or gender-based violence. So we've had a lot of engagement with the Home Office, of the You Are Not Alone campaign, Women's Aid, and the Met Police, all around kind of you know, wanting to be inclusive, and that's really positive. At the same time, Black Lives Matter, I think, for us as an organisation, we've really kind of begun to do a lot of thinking about that now, and how we are actually, are we a really diverse and intersectional organisation? Very last thing, huge demands on our time. We're a small organisation, so lots of demands about evidencing, you know, from commissioners, from the media, from funders, about wanting us to do all this work, which, as Catherine mentioned, we're paid for some of it at Galop. We're quite lucky, but actually we realise if we're not there sometimes, we can, you know, the sector gets missed out. So I'll stop there. It's a real run through. I hope people were able to follow some of that. Thank you.
It was really, really interesting, Peter. Although I have to say I got slightly distracted when you said there's never been an LGBT refuge in London. Is that what you said?
There's never. No, I mean, there's not refuge accommodation. I mean, there's very few across the country, and I think most of us have realised, you know, I mean, women. I think, you know, we support women-only spaces. Don't get me wrong. It's about, as Nicole said, a real patchy provision. And actually, we do find there is a demand for safe spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. That was it was really, really interesting. It was a great, and I know it's a really short amount of time, but we'll certainly have opportunity as well to explore some of that once Saskia and Maddi have spoken. I see Maddi has joined us, so well done, Maddi, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry again.
No, please don't apologise. Saskia, can I go straight to you? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we are a domestic abuse organisation in Cheshire, and we are not a specialist LGBT plus organisation. We just happen to have supported a high proportion of transgender clients in the last 2 years, and I've been speaking with those clients about some of the issues, which hopefully will seem pretty basic to everybody. I can echo everything Peter said about the way the service has been impacted and some of the opportunities and challenges. So I'm just going to briefly talk through them, but I do have one of the Mentimeter things, I think, on the next slide. Oh no, it's us first. So I've already said who we are. Yeah, this one, thank you. So if people can go to that, it will, I believe, show us what the results are. They are anonymous, but it'll show them in real time. And I can definitely say that a few short years ago, despite the fact that I'm a member of the LGBT community, I probably wouldn't have identified myself as being very confident in terms of working with transgender survivors. And as well, there's been a lot of misinformation in the media and scaremongering in the media about working with transgender clients, and we were part of the Stonewall survey. So we believe that there are more opportunities than there are challenges in working with trans men and women. So if we can go to my next slide, I don't know if anybody's from the Mentimeter, but
just bear with me a second, Saskia. Ella, can we go onto the Mentimeter now and see what's actually happened with people's responses? Have we got you, Ella?
Yeah. So this is what it does for this response. So it just breaks it down like this. So is everyone able to see what the responses are at the moment?
No.
No.
Oh, you're not? Okay. No problem.
So I think you need to be on the Mentimeter possibly and share your screen.
I am. I think it's just saying I'm on PowerPoint. Hang on 1 second. Let me just stop sharing and I'll share again.
I should have known better than to try the new technology.
There you go, Saskia.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. That's really helpful. So if we can then, sorry, Ella, go back to the presentation.
Of course.
At least it's you, not me, doing this, Ella.
Sorry, Saskia, I've skipped ahead. There you go.
Not in the whole screen.
I know, sorry, I'm just trying to get there.
So it's 2 slides earlier.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. I just need to read the end of that one. Yeah, thank you. So we provide a whole family service in the community, and we like to think that we were reaching everybody we needed to. But the original trigger for us reviewing our LGBT outreach and the support and the numbers really that we were reaching was a young trans woman who came to us for support in 2016. Her name was Michelle, and the next slide, the next proper slide, is just about what we experienced with Michelle. So Michelle was 15 and she was from a home where there was significant domestic abuse. She'd been removed from the family quite early, and domestic violence was the norm of her family experience. When we met her, she was being exploited by a sex trafficking gang in Manchester, and the staff in the care home were refusing point blank to use her preferred name and pronouns. And of all the really complex issues that Michelle was facing, the issues around sexual exploitation, the issues from her family, and the early trauma and the adverse childhood experiences that she'd had, what she told us was that being misnamed and being misgendered was the thing that was causing her the most anxiety, and it was her most immediate issue. And we just couldn't believe that, you know, 2016, and this young person was very, very clear about their gender, was very, very clear what their name was and what their preferred pronouns were, and that this wasn't being used. And you can see a quote there from Michelle. Obviously, the names have been changed back when we first worked with her. So what we did off the back of that was bring in a specialist organisation to arrange some transgender awareness training for our own team, but also for staff from other agencies. So we had police officers there, social workers, people from the care home, the residential care home, all being able to explore some of those issues in quite a safe space where it was okay to ask questions. And that was a real starting point for us, and was the beginning of us really reviewing how well we were doing with the LGBT plus community. So could you do the next slide, please? So we asked ourselves, why are LGBT plus people not using our services? Because we think our services are great, and we welcome and value diversity. So what was the gap between our intention and the reality that was happening? And what we did at that point was approach local groups, and we're quite lucky in Cheshire. We've got a very well established gay men's support group. There's a lesbian mums group. There's a young rainbow youth group that runs, and there was an emerging quite early trans group, trans support group happening at the time. And basically they were very, very generous with their time and their support, and they had a look at our website at the time and talked to us, and what they were saying was, you know, all of your images are of women, so how do we in the gay men's group know that it's for us? You don't mention trans people anywhere in any of your material, so how are we supposed to know it's for us? That's not what we're seeing. So you're saying it's open, but we're not seeing those barriers that we feel are there being removed by you purposefully. There's no information that's very specific to us. And you know, somebody said to us, an occasional rainbow wouldn't hurt. And that was a bit of a bit of a shock, because it just hadn't occurred to me, which I'm very ashamed to admit. And also that we should go and speak to them in their groups about our service, so that people felt it was trustworthy and they understood what it was. So these were the basic things that we did. We changed our information and added same-sex couples to the images. We talked very specifically about different members of the LGBT plus community in some of our literature. We created banners with rainbows on that were specifically targeting the LGBT plus community. We sent staff out to each of these groups to talk about our service, to meet people, get to know them, and build a rapport. We didn't develop any new information ourselves. We sourced really good information where it existed already. RISE had an absolutely brilliant series of leaflets, and we gained permission from RISE specifically at the time to use their information on trans people and domestic abuse, and we adapted that into our own material with permission. And we talked to Galop, and we put Galop information in all of our centres and made sure all our staff were trained. And then we offered training on domestic abuse for the people in those groups, for the counselling services that were local, that were targeting the LGBT plus community, so that if somebody had a choice, you know, I've got all these complicated issues, and I can either go to someone I absolutely know and trust to be LGBT plus friendly, or I can go to this specialist domestic abuse service where I'm not entirely sure, then, you know, I can understand why the choice would be to go with their LGBT organisation. But what we would all now have the confidence is that the domestic abuse would be understood and it would be picked up. So these are real basic things, and I'm not going to apologise for that, because we had to start with this level of absolutely basic changes. And the next slide is another Mentimeter to ask about those changes. just to say, you know, can you in your own organisations make a commitment that straightforward? And it really was. It wasn't financially costly. It did cost some time, but absolutely more than worth it. And I think, you know, those 5 things are the things that our trans service users have said to us made the difference between them coming and actually feeling that our service was for them and was safe, and not feeling that they could approach us or that they could, you know, come and use any of the services that were available. They're looking like really healthy numbers. I'm going to look at them again at the end, because that's so promising that people are willing to think about these changes, because they aren't huge. And I'm sorry if I'm, you know, being too basic here, but this really made a difference to us. Ella, could you go back to the next slide? Sorry. Oh my God, I think 1 or 2 more.
I really don't think you need to apologise for being too basic, Saskia, but thank you.
Well, it was the basic things that made the difference. So for us as an agency, the things that those 5 minor changes made, that last year, in the last financial year, 10% of our refuge spaces were occupied by transgender clients, and we had previously had none ever. So that was really, really significant. We've had an increase of around about 25% in referrals generally for LGBT clients. We've had more trans clients than L, B and G as it happens, and I think that's because of the work that we did with the group. All our transgender clients were referred by word of mouth from other young LGBT people, or from the trans support group that we've grown to know quite well. The confidence of our own staff to work with trans clients has really significantly grown. We did have early on questions and people who were terrified that they'd misstep somehow and really screw things up, but I think everybody now feels that we can embrace that diversity, that we can really handle it appropriately, and just to treat people in the way that they need to be treated is another simplistic thing, but really makes a difference. I think we understand the complexities differently and the intersections that people face, and that's really important. So we've had a number of Black and minority ethnic trans men of quite young ages, all under the age of 25, who have really struggled because they've got the issues of racism and family challenges to do with religion and religious background, on top of all of the issues around transitioning and the youth, the domestic abuse they've experienced, and mental health issues. Mental health issues are a significant issue for all of the trans people that we've worked with, and we haven't always had easy times getting their issues around their gender identified as part of the vulnerabilities that make their situation complex. We've lobbied locally for change, and we have seen some change. We've made links with Galop and Rise, as I said, and actually earlier this year we did have a real issue around accommodation for one young trans guy that we were working with, and Galop really gave us some good advice around that, and he's now being housed and is receiving appropriate housing benefit, which was a real issue. And then the most important things is that the people that we have worked with who have accessed our service, because we've made them really sure that it is suitable for them, have had some really positive outcomes, and that is fundamentally the main thing that we were hoping for. You can see a couple of quotes on the side there, you know, just somebody taking the time to talk with them through the pros and cons of different options feels like a huge thing, and that's really heartbreaking, because that should be a simple thing that anybody has access to. It shouldn't be a postcode lottery, and it absolutely shouldn't have anything to do with your sexuality or your gender. And the guy who I've called David is the young man who we worked with earlier this year, and he was just so closed in and frightened and full of shame because of his experiences with his family. But he said the trust happened as soon as the worker appropriately named him. And I don't think, you know, again, simple things, but to these people we've worked with have made such a significant difference. The next slide, please. So things to consider, and Peter's already mentioned it, and I'm sure it's pretty obvious, but trans people may have multiple perpetrators. Some of the young trans men that we've worked with have had intimate partner violence from a partner who is being transphobic towards them and physically, financially and sexually abusive, as well as being abused by their own family and experiencing transphobic abuse as well as domestic abuse. Add that to what might so-called honour-based violence from some of the black and minority ethnic people that we've worked with, and you've just got a whole gnarly mess that is really difficult to unpick. And then you have to fight with other agencies to recognise their gender, to recognise their pronouns, to recognise the vulnerabilities that they are facing because of the complex issues, and especially we found around housing and mental health issues there are currently have been our biggest challenges. The other thing to say is that trans people, like everybody, there's no homogenous trans people, so every single case is different and has to be considered individually but holistically to that person. We continue to have this issue with young trans men that we support who are under 25, who are then found ineligible for full housing benefit, and we seem to have the same arguments over and over again. Something I think we say to our team members when they've done their training is it's okay to not know things, but it's only okay to ask somebody about their own experience. Our clients are not there to educate us, so you know, if we need information, we can research it. We've got contacts in specialist organisations who will answer those questions for us. And I think, you know, we have to bear that in mind when we're talking about how people are. This particular client said to me that when having to explain that he had been sexually abused as a woman was horrific, it nearly finished him off. He described it to me and it was devastating. But not having to explain what that meant and what the implications of that were meant that a weight lifted off him, and that's what we want to be able to do. And then the final slide is where I asked people, you know, I said, I'm going to do this, I'm not trans, what do you want me to say, what do you want people to know? Trans people are people, we're not aliens or scary. I put that at the top because about 3 people said similar things to me. Understanding how hard it is to ask for help when the layers of abuse that you're experiencing are so complicated, interwoven and all interdependent, and it's really hard to be confident that you're not going to make things worse by asking for help rather than better. Offering people options, we offered, we explained what all the options were to each person that comes to us, and one young man felt that he would be safer in a communal refuge, and we spoke with him about disclosing his trans status. He said that he would prefer that people knew. We had a discussion with the women in the communal refuge. Everybody was perfectly happy. He went into the communal refuge and we didn't have any issues whatsoever. And I think, you know, we hear a lot about trans women and refuge, and there's lots of scary stories. We don't often hear the voices of trans men, and we've got just that one really positive experience, because other than that, most of the trans men that we've worked with have gone into our dispersed accommodation, but this person chose communal and it was the right decision for them. Also, to let you know, when you're working with young trans people, they're figuring this out for themselves. They don't expect us to be experts because they're not experts themselves. They've not figured everything out, and it's a bit of a journey that we might have to go along some way with them, and support them to kind of explore, or to at least find the right places. And if we need to know things as professionals, just ask, but make sure you really do want to know. One young man did say to me, you know, I don't want to feel like a freak show. I don't want people asking me, you know, what I do with my girlfriend or whatever. That's irrelevant. Please bear in mind that using people's dead names and genders, it's harmful to them. If they've had this as a form of abuse, they don't want it anymore, and absolutely we should not be doing that. Making it a mistake is fine, you know, move on. It's not the end of the world, but don't dead name people or misgender them if you can avoid it. And then recognise how frightening this is, scared of the worker, scared of asking for help, scared of the future, scared of having their own money, scared of everything. And it's our responsibility to kind of offer the support and remove some of those fears. So the last thing is another Mentimeter, which goes back to the very beginning. And I know my bullet points have been sped through at speed and they're really, really basic, but I do wonder if it gives you any additional confidence to support trans people around domestic abuse. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Well, I think the results speak for themselves.
Well, if one organisation does one of those things that we did to make a difference, it will help people, and it's really important. So thank you for listening to my very fast run through.
Thank you so much, Saskia, and it was incredibly powerful to hear the voices of the clients that you've worked with as well. So please thank them for sharing that with us. Thank you. Maddi, I'm going to hand over to you.
That's fine.
Thanks so much for hot-footing it from the Marac.
That's okay, yeah. So I'll just start by apologising for my late arrival and what may be an early exit. Unfortunately, as I'm about to talk about, we're really high capacity at the moment. So I ended up doing Marac today and that didn't finish until 2:30. So I've literally come straight from one thing to another, and then there's some follow-up stuff. So I'll talk about it a little bit more in a bit more detail in a minute, but I just thought I'd introduce myself first. So I'm Maddi. I am the LGBTQ+ specialist senior officer at RISE. So RISE is a domestic violence and abuse charity in Brighton and Hove, but I also cover East Sussex as part of the commission, the wider commission. So our role within the LGBTQ+ service is to support LGBT and or T clients who are experiencing domestic violence and abuse, with casework and safety planning, but also to signpost and support around recovery from abuse and the trauma that they can face. The wonderful people that have gone before me have shared a lot of the information already and a lot of the issues that we are having, so I will try not to repeat myself too much, but I will just go over what's been happening for us within RISE at the moment and the issues that we've been having. So I kind of wanted to make it really black and white, or white and pink in this case, of the data and the differences in referrals. So May 2019 we had 18 referrals into the LGBTQ+ specialist service. So that's a combination of professional referrals, Marac referrals and self-referrals. In May 2020 we had 31 referrals, so it was nearly double. Obviously, there will have been other impacts, such as increased visibility of the service. When I first joined the service 2 years ago, it wasn't very well known. It wasn't very, it wasn't accessed particularly by the community. It wasn't particularly trusted, not for any reason, just because it wasn't very well known. So I think because we've done that increased community networking, as that increased visibility, there has also been an increased trust in the service. So that will have impacted the referrals as well. But we are an awful lot busier than we were in February, and it just keeps going and keeps going. So the reasons why, so if we move on to the next slide, sort of have a look at that. So I think obviously coronavirus and COVID-19 has been the main reason for the increase in referrals, but looking a bit more at the impact that that's had. Initially, it's really difficult to support clients at the moment. We're finding that often it's not safe to speak to them, whereas before they could use excuses such as going to a mental health appointment or going to my GP, and I would maybe even meet them there if need be. We're now having to do that all over the phone. So, and they've lost their reasons to leave the house. They've lost their reasons to have private conversations. So that can be really difficult. Something that I find with a lot of my LGBTQ+ clients is that there's complex needs there. So often even maintaining a phone and maintaining charge on that phone and maintaining credit to respond to me if they can't answer straight away is very difficult for clients. So I've had to do quite a few welfare checks. That all takes time. That can also start to break down barriers build up barriers with clients, because if you keep having to ask for welfare checks, they're going to think, why do you keep doing this to me? I'm my own person. And it's trying to have that explanation. Also unaware of the referral route. So during normal times, as they once were, we worked very closely with community organisations. I did drop-ins, I co-located at drop-in spaces, at community spaces. All of those are obviously shut at the moment. So there will be a lot of people that maybe haven't referred. There will also be a lot of people that aren't able to access me because that was their only way of accessing me when they came in for a more generic LGBTQ+ need to the outside world, and then they were coming to see me within that. The other thing that has been a real issue, and is probably our most prominent issue, has been inappropriate accommodation. As we're all aware at the moment, emergency accommodation has been a lot of hotels. They have literally been trying to just get people into accommodation. I think a lot of that monitoring and screening people when they first enter has gone. So many of my clients have felt unsafe. They've ended up leaving. It's not been safe for them to be there. Refuges are limited options for, they're only for self-identifying women, and then often they're not for self-identifying women. So it's a really small majority of people that have got access to refugee accommodation at the moment. And obviously temporary accommodation is just not appropriate for many people. On a more long-term basis as well, clients that are looking to do housing swaps or are applying and bidding on properties, none of that's been going ahead. So it's actually resulted in a fair few of my clients staying in a home either with perpetrator or where perpetrator knows where they are and continues coming to the property. Something that I've just mentioned as well is about complex needs. As I said, a lot of our clients have complex needs. Other services have shut down altogether or are running on a very limited service, from everything from drug and alcohol support to mental health support, which are the two sort of predominant additional factors and needs for a lot of my clients. So that has been really difficult. And I think, as has already been mentioned, as staff, we've ended up doing a lot of roles in one. So whereas before we were doing just that safety planning, now we're doing safety planning and emotional support. And we're trying to be a drug and alcohol advisor and that kind of mental health counselling, even though we're not counsellors, and we do make that clear to them. We're sometimes the only person that they're speaking to. So it's a lot, we're finding it a lot harder to boundary those conversations, to boundary our role when there's nowhere else to support them. And I think that is having an impact, or I know it's having an impact on staff as well as on the clients that we're supporting, and I think is lowering morale, because we're just not getting that level of, we're actually doing something to help this person. At the moment it can feel a bit like you hang up the phone and all you've done is listen to them be upset for an hour, and actually you've not got anywhere and helped them in any way. And I think that can be difficult when you're on your own working from home. And that kind of moves in quite nicely to the increased impact on mental health. So not just for staff, but for our clients as well. Obviously, there's a lot of anxiety around COVID-19. I find a lot of clients within the LGBTQ+ community and other professionals within other LGBTQ+ organisations that I have spoken to have found that a lot of their clients have health needs, additional health needs. And there seems to be a really high level of understandable anxiety around leaving their house, around contracting COVID-19, which plays into all other areas of support as well. So that anxiety, there's also then the anxiety around finances and financial situations. I have a few trans clients that are very anxious at the moment, not just about these leaked details with the GRA, but also about delays to the GIC clinic. Everything's getting pushed back by months, and then operations, and they've just changed the way that they were selected for surgery, and all of these things are piling on top of people where, when they don't have abuse, would struggle to cope with it, let alone when you add being in an abusive relationship or having abusive parents or recovering from that on top. So we're experiencing a lot of additional challenges at the moment, and that is having a real impact on our resources. We are well over capacity as a service, and I feel that every other service is hitting the same point within Brighton and Hove, and I don't know if that can be mirrored by other services across the country, but I know within East Sussex that's very much a feeling being shared by all at the moment, is that we've really hit capacity, and obviously we will continue to support, and we've been lucky enough to be granted some extra funding by Brighton and Hove Council, but that is not going to kind of immediately mitigate a lot of the issues that we're facing.
You're muted, Michelle.
I'm muted. Thank you, Catherine. I was just looking ways if you to keep on. That was really, really interesting, Maddi. Thank you so much. And I think actually kind of what you've talked about, what we've heard from all three of you across the front line, there is obviously so many shared experiences, challenges, changes, but also hearing some of the differences as well it's just incredibly thought-provoking. So thank you to Peter, Saskia and Maddi. Can I just go to the other panel members first of all? And I think I probably should invite Nicole into this as well. If you would like to ask Saskia, Peter or Maddi a question or comment.
I have a question.
Thanks, Nicole.
I can ask. I mean, I'd just be interested to hear panelists' views about, you know, maybe this seems an obvious question now that I'm thinking, you know, should it be a mixture of services who do what Saskia's done, which I think is amazing. I mean, I've always heard amazing things about you, Saskia, and what you do, and so I completely trust everything you've said, and I can imagine it's been really exceptional. But I am interested in the panelists' view between services kind of welcoming and being much more proactive in this space versus a specialist service set up kind of by and for, and what people think of that, or is it a combination?
Who wants to come in? Peter, are you?
I think it's something we explored in one of our reports, the Recognise and Respond report, and I do think it's kind of both. I mean, there's different. I think this may come out of the commissioning guidance that James and Megan Field have written. Actually, that there's different models, and I think we have to look at, you know, I think ideally, in the one sense, having specialist services, you know, where that's possible, and thinking kind of smartly about those. So, you know, particularly as you mentioned, kind of regional hubs that, you know, in Manchester, Birmingham, Brighton, London, etc. You know, some other cities, is really helpful. But also, I think there is a place for specialist VAUG services to support LGBT women, and men's services to support LGBT men, and you know, as we said, that term generic services, whatever that means. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think it's often that it ends up that there is somebody within an individual organisation, or the will of an individual commissioner, or stakeholder that often drives that forward, and that's the challenge, because actually that is the fragility as well, you know, of funding. So yeah, I think there's all those factors. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but there are different models, I think, of promising practice, and we need to kind of evaluate that. We've heard, I think, about, you know, potentials there to kind of, you know, hear from survivors' voices about what they want as well.
Thanks, Peter.
I agree with Peter completely. I think in an ideal situation where were things appropriately funded so that there wasn't a postcode lottery, we would have specialist LGBT plus organisations for men and women, and for people who identify as non-binary, we'd have specialist organisations for people with disabilities, you know, who that's another area of work where it's additionally complex. But equally, organisations like our own can't become lazy and leave that to the specialist organisations, and you know, have to be able to recognise what our gaps in provision are. That's why we were involved in setting up the National Polish Domestic Abuse Helpline, because the needs of that community weren't being met in our area. That's you know, a different set of issues. I just think the worrying thing for me is that if you're lucky enough to in the Northwest to be in Manchester, there's a brilliant service already run by the LGBT Foundation. If you're lucky enough to land near one of our centres, then yes, you will get what is now a much improved service. Probably still has a way to go, but if you're in just over the border in the next local authority area, you'll get probably very little at all, and it's that worries me more than what the model should be. More that every person who has that need has access to some model and some form of quality support when they need it.
I would echo what Saskia said there about there being a service across the country and that postcode lottery. And I think on a frontline operational basis, I would echo what Saskia and Peter have said about the need for there to be a combination of both. I find some clients and service users who exclusively want to work with the specialist service. That's the only place that they feel safe and they're going to trust in. And then I have some clients who do not want a specialist service and turn it down. And I feel it's quite important for them to be given that option of both. And I think I initially talked about there being that option of both for clients with the with trans clients in mind, really, because not every trans person identifies as trans. But that then went on to actually find that a lot of L and G and B men and women also didn't want a specialist service. They were happy with a more generic service. So I think in an ideal world, with all the funding in the world, we would have an option of both for people across the country.
Thanks, everyone. James.
I was just going to reflect briefly on some of what people have been saying and pick up on what Peter's been saying particularly. So I and someone called Megan Field worked on some commissioning guidance with Galop, and that's been developed and will be published in due course. And I think you know, what part of that discusses the different models that exist around service delivery. And you know, briefly, if I can just kind of set those out, because I think it's helpful. They're really quite different. So you might have an LGBT domestic abuse project based in a generic, as it were, LGBT service, and Manchester is an example of that. A much broader LGBT organisation which has picked up domestic abuse work. Galop is like that too. You might have an LGBT domestic abuse service within a generic domestic abuse service, which is like Maddi and Rise, or you might have an LGBT domestic abuse service being delivered by an LGBT organisation, but within a kind of partnership arrangement, a kind of consortium. And the last one, of course, is you might have a standalone LGBT domestic abuse service, but that last one just doesn't exist. And I think that speaks to the issues of capacity that anyone doing domestic abuse works knows, it's very hard to resource services. I guess the key thing for all of those is it's what is your local landscape like? So, you know, if there is a strong local LGBT sector, that might be sufficiently robust that it can build its own domestic abuse response. If that doesn't exist at all, it's then a question of, well, how can you even start that conversation if you're a generic domestic abuse service, you know, and vice versa. And I think it's also worth thinking about this over time. So the solution you have in 1 year may change. So you might be a domestic abuse service which sets up an LGBT project in consultation with the LGBT sector locally. And actually 3 years, 5 years down the line, you're talking about spinning that out and hosting it in an LGBT organization. So it's really challenging depending on what your local landscape is. But I think it's important that we know what people have in their areas and then work out how we can build that and do that ideally together. So that's the LGBT sector and domestic abuse sector working together. And I guess the thing for commissioners, and I guess I always tend up talking about commissioners, is that they've got a responsibility to try and create the conditions or support the conditions where those kind of conversations can happen, and perhaps lend the resources to help that as well. Because, you know, Saskia said it didn't take additional money to do the work she took, but it took money in terms of time, and that's a commitment by that organisation, and that needs to be recognised. Otherwise, we're asking the already overstretched domestic abuse service to subsidise that work, or we're asking LGBT services and people to subsidise that work, and I don't think that's on really.
Thanks, James.
Can I just come? Yeah, I just wanted to say just a very small point that if we really, we know that the first response to somebody who's a survivor is absolutely crucial. So it's really important that everybody who works in domestic violence or in mainstream services who might have somebody who's a survivor approach them, that they need to be able to have a good response from them. It doesn't matter about their sexuality or their gender identity, their race, their ethnicity, their social class, whether they've got a disability or not. That, you know, that is has to be core business, doesn't it, for everybody who's providing a service that a survivor might want access to, is that they're going to get a good, positive, empathetic, non-discriminatory, non-judgmental response. So even if there is a case for also saying there's specialist services are needed, everybody is implicated and is responsible for making sure that anybody who comes across their door has that good first response.
Thanks, Catherine. And that ties into some of the things that we've learned over the last sort of few years from listening to people, that more often it's not what you do, it's how you do it that counts. Elly, did you want to ask a question?
I guess just to ask James, as the author of that, as a co-author of the commissioning document, is whether he felt it would provide commissioners with enough information to be able to decide which model in their area, or whether you feel there'd be any further research or evaluation that would help commissioners make those decisions.
Gosh, that's a big question. I'm going to answer that slightly differently, if I may. And I suppose for me, a lot of the commissioning guidance is not about the model. So it says this is some of the ways you could do this work, but it's a bit like Catherine framed it. It's about the quality of the response. And some of the things we reflected in on that using, you know, the really basic kind of approach to commissioning, which is about understanding the issue you're dealing with, then planning for it, then doing it, then reviewing it. What was really striking was actually how few local areas understood the needs of their LGBT community. So they didn't have much local intelligence, and it's tricky. There's not necessarily the data there, but you can look to research, you can look to the work that Galop's done nationally to kind of guess what you might have, and you can always build a picture. But the other thing which was really interesting was how few people consulted directly with LGBT survivors. So the people we spoke to, we did a small survey, so it's not representative, but only 30% of commissioners said they had explicitly targeted LGBT communities for consultation. So it meant that if LGBT communities were going to respond, it was someone picking up to a generic survey rather than someone going in and communicating directly within the community. And the other thing that those areas said, a lot of them said, was only about half of them had specific actions or conversations in their strategy or action plans around LGBT work. So most of them had the wonderful line in their strategy somewhere which says, and we know this affects LGBT people too, we've mentioned it, nothing more to see, nothing more to do. And not enough actually said, well, what does that mean? You know, where are we starting? How are we going to build this? How are we going to change that? So I think it's not just about the model. I think it's about commissioners stepping right back with their local services and saying, actually, what do we know? What are the gaps? And how can we build this response? Because it's not going to be a quick fix. And what you often get in national government is responsible for this. And I'm sure Nicole will reflect on this too, that, you know, they say, great, we've got funding for you. Here you go. You're not going to build an LGBT specialist response in a year. By the time that's hard enough in any domestic abuse program. That's even harder if you're trying to establish credibility with a particular community or communities. So, you know, it's a long-term project we're talking about here for commissioners and providers and the local partnership. It's not a one size or a quick solution. That doesn't answer your question, but I feel better having had.
Heaven forbid, James. Thanks very much. I'm going to just quickly put Alison Higgins, Alison, you in Sheffield, slightly on the spot, and perhaps also Peter. And Peter, if you can't answer this question, then we can take this afterwards. But Alison, do you want to ask Peter your question?
I was just going to ask about the demographic breakdown of the LGBT refuge in London that's just been set up. I suppose I was really interested to hear about Saskia's experience, but before that, I was listening to what you were saying and just thinking, how is it working in terms of, I suppose we're thinking in Sheffield about what kind of need there is and what kind of service we want, and so just wanted to ask you a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively new actually. I mean, and it's funded by it's from kind of COVID money, and it's funded by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. It's linked to a community project called the Outside Project, which is amazing. Person called Carla set it up, and they set it up as a winter shelter a couple of years ago. Without giving too much away from its location, I mean, it started very much people just sleeping on the floor. That's what it is. It actually started as Status Quo's ex-tour bus, which was parked somewhere in outer London where people would just rock up for a kind of night shelter. However, they've developed this expertise, and we felt we've partnered with Stonewall Housing, and we saw a chance to kind of get that going as a kind of pilot. So it's only got 4 spaces. It's 4 spaces within a kind of shelter, but the crucial thing is it's got a refuge worker attached to it as well. So it's kind of 24/7 rather than a shelter there. The demographic breakdown is for the Outside projects, as I mentioned, they tend to see a lot of survivors with no recourse, because, as Maddi said, a lot of survivors are actually being housed in hotels, and it's not great. I mean, it's better than actually having to battle with a homeless persons unit to get accepted, but it's not ideal. So so lots of people with no recourse have been coming in or interest. There's a mixture of a couple of gay men, or men who identify as gay or bi, and they're also from BME communities as well. There is somebody who's identifies as trans man as well. I'm not sure if we've had any lesbian or bi women actually yet, or trans women, but it's very early days. And it's interesting that also MOPAC were kind of have set up a kind of pilot male survivor space, because again, there's no men's refuges in London. But when I was talking to, and that's being kind of headed by Victim Support, I think, is one of the organisations. But it was interesting when they were talking about, this is a refuge for men, and you're doing the refuge for LGBT people, and there's not that kind of quite understanding of sort of intersectional things, that actually it could be both. And can we refer to your refuge as well? So there's all, I think, just like James was saying, there's different models actually of providing it, and Rise, I think Maddi could talk about, or James, what they did in Brighton is different. There actually a lot, there's bits of innovation, but it's not in London actually. Most of it's outside of London, in Manchester, in Brighton, in Cornwall actually. There's a refuge space in Cornwall as well. Yeah, hope that answers your question broadly. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Carolina, I'm not going to invite you to ask your question because I think Elly might be about to answer it. So if that's okay, and what I'll do, Carolina, I'll bring you straight in after the next bit of the discussion for you to ask your question before anyone else. I hope that's okay. So Ella, can you start sharing your screen with Elly's presentation?
Yeah.
And Elly, over to you. And I think we're going to do a bit more Mentimetering as well, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Sorry.
Thanks, everyone.
In the hot seat. Thanks, Ella. It's just a few higher up. That's it. Brilliant. So I'm Elly. I'm one of the development workers on this project. The other worker on the project, Heather's also on this call. So hopefully she'll pitch in, as is Alison, who asked that last question, who's the sort of her commitment is why this project's happened. So I hope they both pitch in. So thanks for inviting us so far. This webinar has been such a pleasure for me. And it was really interesting to hear Saskia's presentation about a service having changed from within. This is a project about where change comes from the commitment of the commissioner, and so about change to supporting services on a journey of change from the outside. So we're talking about a year-long intervention looking to improve access to domestic abuse services for LGBT people across South Yorkshire. And it is a bit of a snapshot. And predominantly what I'm going to talk to you about is the sort of learnings and recommendations that have come from it. And a lot of those are things that have come up already, not surprisingly. So before I start, I wondered if we could create a snapshot of all our own experiences of working with our services or strategic area to support LGBT survivors. And if Ella's happy to go to the Menti screen, we're going to use, it's anonymous again, and I'm just going to ask you to choose 5 words to a maximum, I don't think you have to do 5, to try and describe your experience of supporting LGBT survivors in your service or area. So hopefully you'll be being provided with some box to type your experiences in. I know this isn't as simple as a multiple choice.
Oh, the suspense, wow.
Really interesting. I could stay watching this, it's fascinating. I can really see the fragility of it in this, as it sort of limits its, the sort of commitment, the difficulties and its fragility. Everyone's answers to this will keep adding, and at the end we could export this, which might be a really interesting snapshot.
Yeah.
So was that okay for now? That was really fascinating. To go back to the presentation. Thanks, Ella. So essentially, South Yorkshire is not served by a specialist LGBT organisation, and Alison Higgins, who's Sheffield's commissioning manager for domestic abuse and sexual abuse, went to the Merrick scrutiny panel on LGBT victims of domestic abuse and came away feeling like South Yorkshire services needed to improve for LGBT survivors. And the stats, not only in the sort of thinking, but also that the stats were far below the sort of minimum target of 2.5%. And so a plan was made to commission an intervention that would build capacity in mainstream services to improve access for LGBT survivors. And it's a partnership of 4 councils that make up South Yorkshire. So a bid was put into, I guess, the pot that was available at the time, which was MLCLG. A lot of people have been working under this, and it results in short-term projects. So it was a 15-month project with 2 workers. What was useful is that there was a local, well-established LGBT service in Sheffield, so the project could be located there. I put a pioneering project. I've no idea how many examples exist of this nationally. I'd be really interested to know. So that's sort of where it came from and the rough plan. I'm just going to give you the first. Do you mind stopping the slides, Ella? Thanks. So the first task, which is ongoing, was of consultation with LGBT communities of their experience of accessing or trying to seek help from services in South Yorkshire, and I imagine would be quite common experiences. So the first one.
Hello there, everybody.
Hi, someone. Oh.
Go on, Elly, you say.
Okay,
That's
I can
amazing.
hear someone's music or something. I just wonder if everyone could just check their mute. Thank you so much. Brilliant. So I've just picked out a few quotes where, and maybe I'll read them to you for people who are accessing on a small screen. So this first one's from a gay cis guy in Rotherham. I had a very violent partner. I used to drink a lot and take my money. He used to terrify me. I was too scared to split up. I rang the police once and he came and just looked at me and said, "Why did you ring?" I do know friends who've had more positive experiences. It depends who you get. It's a lottery. The second one is of a non-binary person's experience of their gender being invisibilised when they access domestic abuse services. And theirs was, domestic abuse services may say they're open to LGBT people, but do they actually have specialist knowledge? When I access domestic abuse services, no one ever asked my pronoun. And the third is of a trans woman's experience of help seeking, which undermined her gender identity, made her feel even more vulnerable, and she left. If you're going to a domestic abuse service at a vulnerable time in your transition, questioning your identity, even if you pick up on the perception of some transphobia, this vulnerability is heightened 20-fold. I was told as a trans woman by a receptionist of a service that the male toilet is over there. And that is just a small section of the perspectives that people shared with us. And they were not just of services not understanding some of the issues around LGBT domestic abuse, but also of services not understanding LGBT identities. That was really helpful for us to guide where the work needed to happen. So we did what's up on the screen. Our target services to work with were domestic abuse services, sexual abuse, housing, homelessness, police and probation. And in brief, we offered services, training packages for their LGBT champions to become part of a network of champions across South Yorkshire. We wrote a kite mark that services could apply for and be supported through, and offered sort of consultancy depending on what they were needing. And the response from services was absolutely knocking at an open door. They were really keen. Partnerships could not have been easier to establish. Training was chock-a-block. The kite mark was well received. And in that time, what we've seen are sort of small but celebrated changes in practice. So could we go on to the next slide? On that last slide, I put sort of links on the slides if people want to know more about the kite mark or the training packages or the network that we created. then I guess when these slides are shared, you can look through those. But what I really wanted to focus on is what have we learnt and what would be some recommendations. So what we learnt was that we were initially surprised by the low baseline knowledge about LGBT identities, particularly around trans and non-binary identities. And you remember that came out really very clearly in the consultation with LGBT individuals. So a large section of training time has been spent creating a really safe space for workers to ask questions and learn and start to understand why it's so vital to give our service users the opportunity to tell us about their gender identity and sexual identity and their trans history, rather than us feeling afraid to ask or as making assumptions. But those barriers to asking those sort of questions of our service users are very significant, and they're really persistent. So we notice that they're very widespread feelings that these are personal and they'll cause offence, and training sessions, even though they specifically focus on this, aren't showing to impact much on the statistics coming back on who this information has been collected from. So there's percentages of people where we just don't know, these questions haven't been collected, aren't really showing much change. We know that much more is needed before much more is needed in this intervention before services become competent and confident to support LGBT experiences of domestic abuse. And I think if services are really committed to this journey, they really, that comes not from us, that comes from the service managers saying in that quote at the top, this is not a one-off tick box exercise. In addition to training, we need the following. I'm not going to read those out, but that sort of list of other things that are needed. We'd say it's a sort of conversation has started, it's a journey begun, but it's a slow process. And talking to, I mean, that's come up already on this webinar, but also a manager of a trans inclusive refuge who isn't on this panel, who I spoke to at the beginning of the project, said a few years ago, I would have said, yes, we are an inclusive service. But in fact, I almost think we've had to backtrack and learn what it actually means to be an inclusive service to LGBT people, and especially trans women. Whilst we've learned a lot, I now recognise that we still have a long way to go to be an inclusive service, and we recognise it's a slow process. So very much we've learned that. Also, the LGBT identities are very diverse, and Heather and I are both queer, able-bodied, cisgender, white workers, and we share a lot in identities, and so our blind spots are quite similar. And so we've had to work in partnership with other organisations with other specialisms of disability and Black and ethnic minority to, but those partnerships have had the potential to improve each other's practice. So the next thing I just want to, is just to look at some recommendations. So it's about realistic timescales. It's especially if it's a new intervention, you need to develop it, evaluate it, roll it out, and that doesn't happen in a year. But also the conceptual time in services takes time. It's actually, for it not to be token and not to be a tick box, it needs far more time than that. And to reduce the barriers in the LGBT community, it takes time for trust to become established and for referral links to be created, and funding needs to reflect it. And that's really difficult in a time of sort of commissioners competing priorities. That for training is a journey, and it's not done overnight, and it needs to be a conversation that can continue, and workers to be able to sit down and consider actions and reflect on barriers. And what happens without time is that they see the sense, but they can't put it into practice. And without the time to really take it as their own, they come back to us as the experts when they're the experts. And actually what it creates is almost a dependency. That it needs to be committed to all levels in a service. So we found that change, there are definitely some services where it comes from the service managers, and that's fantastic. But in a lot of services, the majority, it comes from LGBT champions or people with LGBT identities in the service. And the quote on the right is an LGBT champion who sort of described the impact of this project on them. They became an LGBT champion since this project existed. I left the training feeling inspired, but was totally deflated within a few hours of being back in the office, as there just wasn't a commitment from management. The training meant I was suddenly aware of survivors I wasn't aware of before, and I now knew we weren't able to support them, and it had a negative impact on my mental health. And I just thought that was really, just really interesting that we can't rely on these LGBT champions to improve our practice. The solutions co-produced at a regional level, what I mean by that is some of the conversations around about ensuring trans and non-binary people are included are difficult conversations, and ideally these are sort of hosted, facilitated at a higher level than between the LGBT specialist organisation and the organisation with concerns, and those solutions perhaps need to be given space and time in a more sort of brokered way. And then specifications making expectations explicit. So specs can say LGBT inclusion, but as James earlier said, it's not enough, and I guess that would be enough if people's knowledge was already high enough to know what that means, but as we know it isn't, and so specs need to be really explicit about what that would mean. So I'm interested, so we started with a sort of word cloud on how you feel it's going at the moment, everyone in the room, and I'm interested, and I don't know how this will work, but what do you feel you need in your service or strategic area to meet the needs of LGBT survivors? I think that's even more of a massive, ridiculous question than I asked James, but it's happening. I'm just... So, Michelle, are you gonna?
No, just say you go for it, Elly. It's brilliant.
So, with this one, it's not a word cloud. You can type whole phrases, and it will just end up as a flowing grid. I find it fascinating. Okay. So we'll just give these a bit of time to read.
Yeah, no rush.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting. Okay. So other than invite to Heather and Alison are on the call to pitch in, that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Elly. And that was a fascinating talk. I think you've given us so much to think about, and also just incredible to see the words and the feedback coming from everybody in the audience as well. So thank you so much for that. Would you like to pitch in? There's obviously no pressure before we go to the panel.
Looks like Alison would.
Yeah. Well, just to say briefly that obviously we knew that it was a short-term funded project and it was the MHCLG funding that we got. I think it's always a problem, isn't it, with those kind of funding rounds, trying to find something to do that feels meaningful and important, that isn't just duplicating what you're already doing. So I completely hear what Elly's saying, but hopefully we're going to be able to extend the project, aren't we? But not through council funding, unfortunately. But I think, you know, it comes back to that knotty issue of funding. But
thanks, Alison. Okay.
Oh. Heather, who's the other worker on the project, might want to.
Hi. Yeah. No, I think Elly
pretty
much covered everything. But yeah, I think it's just that sort of concern that, like the person from the training raised, that we'd sort of opened a door, made awareness of there are all these issues and all these unmet needs, and now I know about it and we can't serve it. So just the importance of sort of not doing that as a project, to make sure that actually we continue long enough to actually instigate some change, rather than go and telling all the services, well, here's everyone that you're not providing for, here's everyone that's got barriers to your services, and now off we go. And I think that's a real sort of issue and concern sort of across the board with any sort of short-term project. I think other people have mentioned it earlier about that sort of real need to, you know, 3-5 years, not, you know, that 12 months you can sort of just open a can of worms and then disappear again, and that can potentially be more problematic. So we're just concerned about not doing that. But we are going to be continuing for another 12 months, fingers crossed. So hopefully that'll give us a bit more time to address the issues.
Yeah,
just finally, just wanted to say that I've learned so much from it, and it's been absolutely great working with Say It and Heather and Elly, and I think that it's just been a fantastic opportunity. And so I would, even if you only get short-term funding, I think people should go for it anyway.
I'd love for us in some way to kind of be alongside you over the next 12 months as well, so that we can kind of see what's happening and share learnings and what have you. But we'll talk about that after today anyway. But it would be really fascinating. I'm sure the audience would love that, and obviously we can promote what you're doing and what's happening. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Carolina, would you like to, does your question, does it still real, or did Elly and her colleagues cover it?
No, they literally, it was like reading my mind, but I do have a little bit of a follow-up if I can, Michelle.
Yeah, go on, Caroline, of course.
And actually, it's as well for all of the panel and Nicole. We, and as Peter knows, because he was supporting us in Islington with a lot of training being delivered to everyone. We have been quite a thorough-ish VOG training for, you know, all partners, charities, third sector working in Islington, as much as the statutory as well, and the police. But we've been running it for a few years and monitoring the attendance. We've noticed that actually it seems to be, which is, you know, great, because this is a good it's across good training, it's the same suspects. So we think it's quite inconsistent, and we know that some organizations, you know, there's a lot of excuses. It's always like, well, we know this training is brilliant, it's recommended by our colleagues, someone else who we know went and seen it. But, you know, the basic raising the awareness of domestic abuse, they will do. But everything else that kind of really should be done, but it's not kind of written within their policies. They've not been made to do it. It's just constant excuses about, we don't have the time, we don't have the capacity. You know, even when the training, sometimes we pay for as a local authority for them to access for free, we just can't get them in. So I don't know whether, you know, there's any kind of a plan around some, you know, some scrutiny across organizations about minimal standards and people attendance, and how you guys from the third sector promoting your training to those people who notoriously just refuse to attend. Sorry, that was very complicated and lengthy, but hopefully it made sense.
Yeah, it did. I'm actually just going to just very quickly jump in. I'm just wondering whether, Catherine, is there anything that you think your answer might help with your presentation might help with that? Because if so, we could go straight to you.
No, not specifically. I mean, it's interesting because in Scotland, what they did around transgender inclusion was that they said that you couldn't get any funding for domestic violence related work unless you had built in to your application how a policy around providing a service for transgender people. So they just made it a requirement of funding. And that's an interesting approach, isn't it? That you actually make it a requirement of funding, that you will set aside a certain proportion of your funding for training and continual professional development, and that you will expect, even if you can't expect everybody, that you will expect a certain percentage or certain key people in your organisation to go to training and then, what do they say, cascade down. But maybe that's something to consider for commissioners, is how do you just make it have to be explicit in mainstream statutory or third sector organisations that they are expected to do something.
Yes, we kind of do that. So I, kind of a joke Facebook person, I am a commissioner, and we do this for all of our commissioning contracts. But obviously we don't have power across, so I wonder whether this is just our fault, that we have to speak to the wider partners and organisations and like voluntary action Islington and just say to them, have you got it in for everyone else, and just make it a bit more standardised and just a bit braver about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina and Catherine. Catherine, are you okay just to kind of take the floor now? And Ella will put your PowerPoint on. Thank you very much.
I haven't got a PowerPoint.
Oh, no, you haven't, have you? Lovely.
Sorry, I'm not.
That's absolutely
I'm not
fine.
going to speak for very long. I just thought it was really, really important to hear from practitioners on the front line who are kind of dealing with things at the moment during COVID. I mean, it seems to me that Peter referred to the public story, and it is something that I do bang on about, because I think it is quite important to understanding why change needs time and investment of time and resource, because what we're up against really is a real shift in how people understand what domestic violence is and who can be victimised by it and who can be a perpetrator of it. And the public story at the moment is that it's a problem of heterosexuality, that it's a problem of heterosexual men, cisgender, for cisgender heterosexual women. It's primarily a problem of physical violence, and it's primarily a problem of a particular presentation of gender. So the big, strong man is physically violent towards the small, weak woman, and that binary of male, female, and of passivity and activity, weakness and strength. These are really, really powerful ideas that the field is saturated by and with. So you can push the door open. People want to be able to provide a service for LGBT people, but translating what they're learning in those training sessions into what does that mean for practice when the practice is set up around that public story, that's a big ask. And it is something that people are not necessarily able immediately to see how you do that, because what can happen is that if that's the public story, then if you've got two women or two men, however they're identifying their sexuality or their gender identity, then they can be assumed to be not as much at risk or at harm than if it's a man being violent towards a woman, because it's two women, and women aren't aggressive, so it's not going to be as risky. And if it's two men, well, they're aggressive anyway, so they're used to fighting. So again, the risk is not going to be seen as great. And then often practitioners forget all their expertise in domestic violence and start to think, well, who's the perpetrator? If you've got two women or two men, which one's the perpetrator and which one's the victim? Instead of looking at power, that's what feminism tells us, is that it's about power and control, and put aside what somebody looks like or what gender is being performed in front of you, but looking at power and asking those questions about who makes the decisions, who's in charge, who's the relationship for, what kind of tactics of control are being used, that those are the questions. And you can ask those about any couple, and indeed any relationship if it's a family relationship, because it's about power and it's about the abuse of power. And abusive people use a whole range different behaviours that that can coercively control somebody. So practitioners are trying to deal with that, and that's a big ask. But also, LGBT people are also having to cope with that public story. So they also don't think that what's happening to them is domestic violence or abuse. And they don't know where to go. And as Saskia has pointed out really brilliantly this afternoon, if you don't see yourself in a service, why would you go there? If you don't hear people talking about you, why would you go there? And if you've got no evidence that you can trust a service to deal with you in a respectful way, in a non-judgmental way, in a non-discriminatory way, why would you go there? So there's also how LGBT people understand what's happening to them. And a lot of people don't call what's happening to them domestic violence and abuse because they think that's what happens in straight people's relationships, not what happens in their relationships. So there's a job of work to do in those communities as well, which is what Saskia was talking about as well this afternoon, which is about doing outreach. It's work. You have to go out and speak to people and kind of raise awareness amongst those communities about what it is, what the problem is and what the options are. And where's a useful place to go to locally to get the help and support that you need. And I think what we've, in our research around help seeking, it's clear that LGBT people don't really use mainstream services like the police, and they don't really use specialist domestic violence services, whether they're women only or generic, as Saskia has said. Not really. They don't use them. Why? Because they don't think they're for them. But when they do use them, what our research suggests is when things are escalating, and or when they're getting more frightened. And I think the conditions of COVID lockdown has probably exacerbated both of those things. In terms of fear and in terms of escalation. So for me, it's not surprising that the existing LGBT domestic violence services might have been receiving more calls or more friends and family calling because they're worried about their LGBT relatives or friends. But it wouldn't surprise me either if part of the spike in the police reports that we're reading about is LGBT people. Of course, we wouldn't know that because Manchester's the only police service, really, I think, that can identify the relationship and identify when people are LGBT. And even there, they're recent, well, not so recent, 16, 17 figures said that once they changed their data collection, I think they've got, I can't remember, 775 people who identified as LGBT. That's 0.4% of the local LGBT population of Greater Manchester. If you accept that we should work on the basis that about 5% of the population is LGBT. So, it's very disproportionate when we know that the England and Wales Crime Survey and the recent Office for National Statistics analysis of sexuality shows bisexual women, I can't remember if it's twice or 3 times as likely to report partner abuse, and lesbians not twice as likely, still more likely to report partner abuse than heterosexual women. So there is clearly a problem in these relationships. They didn't do the analysis on gay or bisexual men, but one they did in 2016 showed equally that their bi and gay men are much more likely to report partner abuse in the England and Wales Crime Survey than straight men. They don't ask about gender identity, so we don't know about trans people in either of those pieces of work. So visibility is the other key thing. How do we make the needs of LGBT people more visible? And I think one of the ways we can do that is with monitoring. And monitoring, I know people think, oh, it's just a tick box exercise, but if you actually take it seriously, it requires quite a lot of an organisation, because it requires you to be ready to ask the questions, to know why you're asking the questions, and to be comfortable asking questions about not just sexuality or gender identity, but also race and faith, age, disability, even social class would be a useful one. But so it's not a tick box exercise, it's actually showing commitment within your organisation to do something that's quite a bit of work for everybody to be on board, so that, you know, in Elly's example, the receptionist doesn't point out the men's toilet to a trans woman who's coming to use the service. So it's everybody's business to be on board with that kind of training that you need and confidence building that you need to do monitoring. So one of my Mentimeter, I don't know if this worked, I sent it quite late yesterday, so I don't know if it has.
No, I think we've got it, Catherine.
Brilliant. So just to ask you, who does monitor and for what? So if you wouldn't mind just doing that. I mean, obviously it might not be appropriate to everybody, but. Thank you. I wonder, the supplementary question, which of course I didn't ask, is how many don't knows come up in that public monitoring data, or empty boxes, whether it's actually completed for every person who uses that service, and where the gaps might be and why. But that, I mean, that's looking great, isn't it? I'd love to see that data. If you would send it to me, I'd be very happy. I'll put my email in the chat. So yeah, so visibility is the other issue, really, and kind of that's the evidence that we need, isn't it? That there is a need there, and that's an argument there, not only, well, for any of those different models that James was talking about, the different kinds of services that can be made available, that people understand that there will be somebody there, or the organisation will understand them. That's just a huge part of people feeling that they can ask help when they need help. And I think the other part of the jigsaw, I mean, other people have said this, but like, I live in the Northeast and there's no specialist domestic violence service. I'm on the board of a women's domestic violence project, and we're just now looking at our website to try and get it changed. But if you can have I mean, we've got a quite good website, but if you look at the front page of our website, it just talks about women and children. If you click the tab that says what is domestic abuse, it's brilliant. It couldn't be written in any better way in terms of inclusivity, about different kinds of relationships, sexuality, gender identity. But on the front page, it says women and children. And, you know, people who are searching, what are they going to do? They just read the front page really quickly. And if they don't see themselves in it, and we've had a rainbow on it, but then it got confused with COVID-19, didn't, because rainbow meant something else during COVID. So, you know, is it a rainbow or is it a flag that you need? So that, to try and make a distinction so that people in the know what you mean. And partnerships in those parts of the country where there just isn't a specialist domestic violence service with LGBT kind of ready, confident, trained people, do you have partnerships with the local LGBT groups? Not because they're going to do the work, because they're not experts in domestic violence. You're the experts in domestic violence, but having partnerships with those organisations might help to build capacity with them if you work with them and they they can offer different kinds of support for people who you refer to them if they're survivors, but also starts to help you with your awareness raising within your own organisation about LGBT issues more broadly, which you can then use to make sense of the particular issues that people might have when they're survivors of domestic violence and abuse. So being explicit, I think that's really important. So we want to make LGBT survivors visible, but also agencies providing help who say that anybody can use their service and that they treat everybody the same. They need to say what that actually means if you're LGBT. What does it actually mean if somebody's going to come out? How would they know that when you say anybody can use our service, how would they know that that means them? I suppose that's the question that you could kind of think about in terms of, are you ready to, where are you in your journey of being ready to be a fully inclusive service, whether that's that you provide the service or you know where to refer if you're fortunate enough to live near specialist services who can provide that specialist service.
Catherine.
Yes.
Sorry.
That enough.
Well, we have a question that you sort of slightly leading us into, and what I'm going to do is to not go to the panel at this point, but want for Viv Bickham to please ask her question. And obviously, Catherine, we can offer that out to the panel if it isn't something that you can answer. Viv, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. I work for the Drive project, so we work with perpetrators of domestic abuse. And one of the things that we're currently looking at is that from our data, we have a real gap in providing services to perpetrators within this cohort. So my question is, what do you think would be useful in offering services to perpetrators to reduce re-victimisation? And do you feel, is there a gap in perpetrator programmes specifically for the LGBT plus community?
Yes, and yes, there is a gap and it does need to be done. I've just recently finished a project on people who use abusive behaviours in LGBT relationships, and we did some work with providers of perpetrator services as well as speak to LGBT people who have used violence or abusive behaviours in their relationships. And the service providers almost all said there's no purpose-made group work programme for LGBT perpetrators. I mean, but that in itself raises a question: would you have LGBT people in the same group? Is that appropriate? What people were doing is doing kind of ad hoc one-to-one work, and some people have built up some skills in that, definitely. So people at Respect have been doing some work around this, and they'd be a good place to go to for the work they've been doing. And some individual people, consultants, have been doing some work around this as well. But it's definitely an area of work that needs to be more looked into. But I think what we realised as well, having spoken to and interviewed people who'd used violence and abuse, and I mean, most of the research that's done on perpetrators in domestic violence is done with what they call clinical samples. So these are typically heterosexual men who have been convicted or have joined voluntarily perpetrator programs, and the programs are either in the community or in prison. Well, you can't do that with LGBT perpetrators because those programs don't exist, and very few are visible in the criminal justice system. So we just asked people, LGBT people, to complete a survey and then take part in interviews if they'd used while we selected them. They had to be in a previous relationship before we would agree to interview them for ethical and safety reasons. But what we realised is that almost everybody that we interviewed who had used violence or abuse were not perpetrators. What they were was survivors. But this is where the public story comes back in, because of this binary between perpetrator and victim. So their understanding of a victim of domestic abuse is a heterosexual cis woman who is absolutely passive and without agency. And we know that's not true. We know that heterosexual women, cisgender or not, have got agency, but that's not what the public story tells us, because what we want to, the way that we get sympathy is to present people as the ideal victim. So they haven't done anything wrong. They can't be blamed for what happened to them. And so what we realised was that people we were interviewing, they'd fought back, they'd shouted, they'd screamed, they had occasionally hit back, retaliated, or in self-defence, but they weren't perpetrators. They were people who were being systematically coerced over several years in many of the cases. And I think that is my worry with perpetrator programmes. If they if they just adopt the same kinds of approaches of heterosexual men's perpetrator programmes, I am wary that we would miss that, because of that thing about who's a perpetrator and who's a victim, if it's 2 women or 2 men, and without really properly speaking to people and getting the picture of the relationship rather than the incident that's brought them to wherever they are, that we might miss that with people who are LGBT and or T too easily. So yeah, more work needs to be done, absolutely, definitely.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks for your question, Viv. Well, I was going to say, I have no idea how the last 2.5 hours has gone so fast. I do know exactly how it's gone so fast, because it is absolutely fascinating. And despite the weather, I would really happily listen for another hour. I just wondered if the panel anybody from the panel, before I hand over to Suzanne, just wants to come in for 2 minutes, just with any sort of summary or comment, add on to what Catherine said.
One thing I'd like to sort of flag actually is this, which comes out of what Catherine says about kind of inclusiveness, is there is recent use in the wider kind of sector. We talk about the whole discourse around domestic violence versus violence against women and girls, and where does LGBT domestic abuse or gender-based violence sit within that? And I think that's a really kind of interesting sort of next step, really, because if there is, and I totally understand like why the need to sort of talk about violence against women and girls, because of all of those things, that are, well, proportionality and gender inequality. And so I think it's really important though that LGBT domestic abuse and other forms of interpersonal violence still sit within that or alongside it, and that's a kind of unresolved thing, because as you say, Catherine, the thing around gender dynamics is gender is still hugely important, as your work and Marion Hester's and even in an LGBT context and what we see around how that plays itself out. So I think it's important for that to be in there, and we don't get siloed off into a kind of equalities, vogue, and then LGBT sitting outside of that. So that to me is a questionable thing. How do we do that when we are talking about gender-based violence? Yeah, it's an interesting scenario, dilemma. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Peter. Anybody else quickly from the panel?
I mean, I'm just thinking about what Peter's saying. I think it is absolutely crucial, but I think as well, if we can, of course, gender is important, but we have to try and find a way of being much more intersectional about this, because it isn't, because the group woman is diverse. And we have to be able to be saying that it isn't only about gender, it is about sexuality, it is about race, it is about disability, it is about social class, it is about age. and that for me, I'm moving more and more to, it's about power and control, and then your identities shape and influence how you will make sense of what's happening to the abuse of power and control that you're experiencing, and how you understand it, how you, and whether or not you seek help and when. But it'll also shape how you're perceived by help providers, and that's why you can't get away from those intersecting identities that are so crucial to making sense of yourself and being made sense of.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to hand straight over to Suzanne.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to be really quick, but my God, there is so much that's come up this afternoon, so it's going to be hard. I did try and keep my jacket on, but honestly, I was melting into a little puddle. Even my computer's sweating. So I had to take the jacket off, so excuse me if I look a bit informal. I haven't got my gin ready yet, though. So I think that, you know, 3 really big things that have come out for me this afternoon. 1, provision. If we keep raising awareness, but there's nothing there for people, it's hopeless. But not just any old provision. It needs to have standards. It needs to have principles. It needs to have values. It needs to be intersectional. We need that to be connected across different parts of the country, and different types of provision connected to each other and feeding off each other, and really kind of making sure that the safety net is super strong, no matter which door you want to walk through, no matter which bit of your identity feels like the bit that kind of you want to connect to. We've got to make sure that there just isn't a kind of wrong door, and that every door you walk through has got really great standards, and that there is a door in the first place. Second thing was really take the point that a number of our speakers made about staff morale. This is actually something we were talking about just yesterday as an operational management team at SafeLives. People are under so much pressure at the moment. We're not even a frontline service provider, but our team is feeling it. It's been a long time under lockdown. There's a lot of things that we're all worrying about, whether it's personal things or professional things, or a mix of both. And staff wellbeing is under a lot of pressure. And I think particularly what people have expressed this afternoon is that when you work in small services and there aren't enough of them, you're holding a lot more than you were specifically designed for. And that's what I've heard from all of the speakers this afternoon, is that really you're trying to kind of be all things to people because you know that you're the only thing there. And again, that kind of goes back again to provision. Somebody on our call about this yesterday said, you know, we're all trying to kind of get to the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the changing situation, but we also need to be better at navigating the tunnel itself. And you know, it's hard to think about kind of this process going on and on and on, but what we've got to think about, it's just real life, is that the government has spent all of its money during this period doing various things for the economy. So things aren't necessarily going to have that kind of bright, shiny light at the other side. So we're going to have to stay resilient, stay creative, we're going to have to look after each other. And that brings me on to my third point, which is what I felt this afternoon is the most tremendous feeling of solidarity and warmth. You know, I feel quite a lot of the time like different groups are pitted against each other, different people facing disadvantage are pitted against each other. And, you know, but what I felt this afternoon is a really, really strong sense of solidarity. And if we can kind of keep that going, if we can keep that growing and learning together, and that open conversation about things that, you know, each of us don't have expertise in, but we really want to get better and we want to learn about it, we want to action it, then, you know, then we can look after each other when things are really, really pressured and really hard. 2 final things just by way of close. Amazing work, Ella, on the Mentimeter. It's my new favourite thing. I want it on literally everything I'm ever going to do in the future. Those little bubbles, oh, it's just gorgeous. And I can't finish without saying that it was so lovely to hear some Northern voices on the call this afternoon. I know I've kind of lost my Northern voice a bit, but my God, it comes back when I listen to some Northerners, and I love it. So I just wanted to do a big shout out for the Northerners. It's been such a good afternoon. Thank you so much to all the speakers. You were all fantastic. Thank you to everybody who's given up the time this afternoon to take part. There's a load of stuff for us to do. My God, there's a lot for us to do, but it has been a really nice afternoon. Thank you all very much indeed. And to you, Michelle, as well, for chairing.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody. Please look in the chat, and yeah, the panel, you've been amazing. I can't thank you enough, and everybody now can go and enjoy the sunshine or whatever.